Okay, so for my second book reflection, I'm reflecting on the Mysterious Benedict Society and the Perilous Journey. So this is the second book in the series, and I'm rereading it and enjoying it so much. I'm already on the fourth book. Um, so I'm just gonna kind of go through chronologically and just give my thoughts on things as I've been doing. So the first thing that stands out to me is on page one. And that's what's so cool about Stewart's writing is, um, he'll pull you right in depending on how you're reading it or where you're looking at. And it describes Rini and it says these characteristics, and then he says, and he was entirely alone. So Rini, like Nicholas Benedict, especially in the prequel book that I'm reading now, they're characters that have to deal with the loneliness a lot. They're characters that they have big hearts and they want to kind of be with people a lot, but they have to learn how to be comfortable and deal with themselves on their own. And the reason I'm smiling is because this is exactly what I'm going through right now. And what I really like about Stewart and his position on this is he doesn't really give, at least to my reading, my understanding, he doesn't really give a quick tip. He doesn't really give a escape or a quick well, he deals with loneliness by doing this. He kind of just says that Rini and Nicholas in the fourth book, they kind of just deal with loneliness by dealing with it, confronting it straight on, sitting with it, and not really trying to control it or escape from it or find another way around it. They kind of just deal with it face value, right up, right at its face. And that's a very mature way of describing how to deal with loneliness for a kid series, right? Now, granted, he does end up reuniting with his friends, um, and the loneliness goes away, and it's in part also, of course, driven by purpose, which he talks about. And that can be very fulfilling and kind of get you out of your thoughts and out of your head about your loneliness. But while he's lonely and while Nicholas is lonely in the fourth book, they just do whatever they can. They find ways to make life exciting, make life interesting because people aren't there for them. And that's what I try and do as an adult. I struggle with it immensely, but they seem to do at least a better job than I. It says on page 8, Rini felt more than a little sheepish about how tightly he clung to every word from the others, none of whom he'd ever said anything about missing him. So this is so, when I read this, I highlighted, I'm like, this is me, right? I think like Rini, because I have this big heart that's just too big for other people, or not something other people want to deal with all the time. The other way to think about it is I feel this way sometimes, like when I go away from my friends and they don't text or call me ever, until we see each other again and we reunited in person. I think to myself sometimes, like, did they really miss me? I'm sorry for the camera here. I think to myself, like, did they really miss me? And it turns out they do. They just don't. They express that longing differently than calling or texting and saying, "Hey, man, I miss you," or "Hey, what checking in. How are you?" You know, um, they just kind of wait until they see you again, and then they are reminded, sort of about how much they like being around you by making the most of the moment. And that's sort of what I think Stewart's kind of suggesting here with this contrast between Rini contemplating on his thoughts and not him thinking people don't want to be with him, and then he's with people again. Is that Stewart writes somewhere later down the line, and I didn't annotate this, I don't have it exact, but Stewart kind of suggests that Rini, and the gang are really, it's a luxury to be in each other's company again. They're really able to enjoy each other's company in the moment again because they were deprived of it for so long. And this is another message, another concept lesson that I think is important for us, right? That we got to learn how to deal with living on our own and living alone and doing things on our own and entertaining ourselves and enjoying ourselves. But that way, when we are with other people again, it's actually a much more fulfilling, much more fun, much more meaningful experience. And we know because how much we miss them and now we have this opportunity to relish to be with them. So I think that's something he brings out early in the book. And then one major theme of this book is expecting wickedness, having an expectation of evil and what to do about that, how to sit with evil. And yeah, and so this starts off on page 37, where Rini says to Mr. Benedict, he asks, how can it possibly be a blessing to know that people are untrustworthy? And Mr. Benedict says, are you assuming most people are like that? Have you considered the possibility that wickedness is simply more noticeable than goodness? That wickedness stands out, as it were? Um, and then Mr. Benedict says, but as I do, Rini, you must guard against old habits leading you astray. For someone as observant as you, deadly serpents always catch the eye. But if you find that serpents are all you see, you may not be looking hard enough. So first off, this writing and this sort of metaphor and this sort of language, although simple to understand, deals with a pretty deep idea that I don't think I would have picked up the first time I read through this book as a fourth or fifth grader. And I don't know how many fourth or fifth graders are picking up those ideas. But they're very well worded, very well expressed, very simple to understand, and deal with themes that are important as adults, right? I think there's this like idea of like, it's some concept I learned in social psychology while I was reading through this. I don't remember the name of the concept, but it's this idea that, why is it that the American government spends way more money fighting terrorism than fighting cancer? Knowing, even though everybody knows that cancer kills way more people than terrorism does. Well, it's because terrorism's out. It's out there. It's in your face. It's, it stands out, right? Cancer is just sort of this, it's just sort of this main baseline thing. It's not something that sticks out in your face, right? Even though it kills way more people, it's not as intense as terrorism is, and so terrorism is what is attacked. And so whatever concept explains that phenomenon and why there's a tendency amongst societies to do that is very similar to what Mr. Benedict is trying to get Rini to understand about human nature and how he thinks himself, right? Is that he's always kind of just expecting the worst thing to happen, or evil, or someone to pop out of the corner, and he has a very valid, reason behind that, because in the first book they dealt with, a bunch of evil people under Mr. Curtin and how they deal with the 10 men in this book, right? So he has very valid reason for thinking someone's going to pop out of the corner all the time and be evil. But he's still, thinking to himself that this is just how life is, that there's just a lot of evil people. And Mr. Benedict is saying that you got to look harder for the good. And I think this is similar because to the concept as related earlier, I think the majority of people, I think 70-80% of the population is good. But we don't ever really see it or pay attention to it because we're always looking at the 10 or 20% that's trying to ruin everybody else's life. We're always looking at the 10 or 20% that stands out, that's intense, as opposed to the 80% that's dull and boring. And I think that's the case not just with how we expect people to be in terms of being good or evil, but also how we expect our own lives to be, right? And that we sort of 10% to 20% of our lives, there's something about 10 to 20% of the time we spend living, there's exciting things that are intense, that stick out, that we kind of want to think about all the time. And then the other 80% is sort of dull, boring monotony, right? And we just try and focus on the 10 or 20% while we're in the 80%. And this is, again, something that I've personally been dealing with. As I'm making this video, I've personally been dealing with how do I spend time being comfortable by myself alone, and that's why I'm making this video. Like, it's because this is something to do, right? I've read this book. I want to give my thoughts on it. I want to share those thoughts, right? So, like, this very video is a manifestation of what this book is talking about, which is that we spend most of our lives, 70 to 80%, it's dull, it's boring, it's the same thing every day, at least for the majority of people, right? And then there's that 10 to 20% that's exciting. We want to go into that, right? And so it's similar to, as far as this idea of evil standing out, it's similar to like how social media companies know that they make money when they put into the algorithms or into the feed like content that's very divisive, very polarizing, right? Not necessarily evil, that's often the case, but just intense and in your face, right? And then it trains you to think that the whole world is just full of division and divisiveness. There's no unity anywhere. When the case is that divisiveness stuff is statistically, objectively speaking, maybe 10 to 20% of what's going on, but the other 80% is just unity, right? So it's very similar concept. And so that whole sort of stream of thought emanating from this discussion that Rini and Mr. Benedict are having, I think is very notable. On page 39, it talks about the old hags. We're introduced to what the old hag is, which for Mr. Benedict and Mr. Curtin, because they both have narcolepsy, is a ancient name for one of the more common hallucinations associated / accompanied by in narcolepsy, usually also accompanied by sleep paralysis of a hunched figure at the end of one's bed, right? So it's like the witchy kind of, face, and they're kind of hunched over, Now, another discussion comes up as far as this good and evil and how it kind of comes about, which I really like, which is Rini says that he surmises that the old hag caused Mr. Curtin to react differently. So the reason why Mr. Curtin is so controlling of everything, that's not just because he's just has this internal disposition want to control everything, but Rini says it could be because that's how Mr. Curtin decided to deal with the old hag. He wanted to prevent the old hag. He wanted to never ever have to deal with or see the old hag and deal with the nightmare and so he just became obsessed with controlling anything and everything in order to try and prevent that, knowing, of course, and this isn't mentioned by Stewart at all in the series, but it's implied, I think, that he still has to deal with it. That Mr. Curtin, for the most part, lives in denial, right? That he still has to deal with the old hag, and yet he just has been consumed by this strategy of controlling everything in order to try and prevent it. And he may have reduced the experience for himself somewhat. We don't really know. Stewart never really makes a comment on it. But it's likely the case that he still deals with it and he's living in denial. And nonetheless, it's sort of like the sunk cost fallacy for him of just continuing to want to control. And so that's, again, it plays on the theme of control in the first book. Wanting to control everything is what leads us to evil, or that's the implication for Stewart, is that Mr. Curtin, in wanting to control everything, he just took that to the logical extreme. Now he wants to control everybody, right? He wants to control everyone, and he'll do anything that he has to do that, because the old hag is just so bad, or because the lack of control is just so difficult for him, and that's what leads him to be evil, right? He started out like Mr. Benedict. He's a smart guy, he's a scientist, he's a good guy, he's helping humanity, but then he has this problem confront him, he has this hardship confront him, and he chooses to differently than Mr. Benedict. Mr. Benedict just decides to deal with it and face it and just live with it his whole life and make the best of it and learn from experience and adapt over time despite still having nightmares of the old hag, right? And so Rini's sort of the same. He's dealing with his loneliness. Mr. Benedict is dealing with his lack of control and this nightmare that he faces. They're both sort of dealing and confronting their problems, sitting with them, sitting in them, not giving into them, but just kind of sitting there and just doing whatever they have to do to endure it, as opposed to try and control them or find a way out. And I think that is super poignant, not just for my own life and for adult readers and for kid readers, but a super poignant way of answering that problem. What else? So, yeah, there's a part where Rini detects in Mr. Benedict that he is only sad for his brother. He's not angry or fearful or troubled so much as he's just sad. And that Stewart could be suggesting here that the good people tend to be sad more when they're dealing with evil, they're dealing with hardship, rather than angry. That is something I think is a little bit more catered to kids, that the good kind of cry and the evil they go straight into anger. It's a little more complicated than that. We'll see that even crying can lead to evil, and that can be the case for some other authors, but that's just a little idea I wanted to kind of touch on. Um, there's the 10 men, the 10 man, right? And you keep thinking to yourself, Tin Man or 10 men, but it's 10 man because it's a man that has 10 different ways of hurting you. So I like how Stewart kind of trolls us throughout the book with that. This expectation of wickedness comes back a little later on page 80. Rini says he only felt, despite Mr. B's argument, that wickedness was something to be expected. Page 84 has a really, really complex emotional passage. I'm not really going to spoil it, but it's just talking about how to deal with your heart and brain and weighing them, especially as a kid in a world full of adults, or as an adult in a world full of kids, if you want to take that interpretation. He doesn't write that, but that's kind of how I was interpreting it. Page 129 is a really sort of eye-opening discussion about psychic abilities, or magic. And Constance, this 3-4-year-old, she's able to predict things before they happen, within the moment or within a few moments or within a few minutes, as opposed to an actual psychic that can supposedly predict your life, years from now. And she says that how it works is that people's minds notice things all the time, but people don't even realize it. Sights, smells, temperature changes, etc. So while we may not be paying attention, our brains are recording and processing all of this information, and these observations make up a pattern. And then if you're good with patterns, you can figure out what patterns are going on and detect them, and thus predict, what's going to happen next based on the pattern. So psychic abilities are really just highly developed unconscious pattern recognition. And that's what Constance does. And that's also what we see Nicholas do in the prequel book. And then she says, it might seem like I'm a psychic, even though I'm not, right? So really cool discussion, right? We find out magicians, psychics, what's really the source behind their abilities is just highly developed unconscious pattern recognition. I thought that was a really concise, simple, maybe a little wordy, but a concise and simple explanation, even for a kid's book, on how those things work. And even for an adult, it's like you got to remind yourself, like magicians, that's what they do. Like psychics, con men, that's what they do, is they're good pattern detectors. And then we've got the theme of expecting wickedness. This continues with Rini when he's contemplating on the trustworthiness of Captain Noland. I love his name, Noland, no land, right? Because he can't ever be on land. He's always got to be at sea. So his name is Noland. I didn't figure that out initially, but when I did, I was like, okay, Stuart, I see what you're doing here. And on page 142, Rini says, compared to Mr. Benedict, even the best of men are untrustworthy. One could still be considered among the best of men and still be untrustworthy. So he's sort of maybe intuiting for himself against Mr. Benedict that there maybe is not even necessarily an evilness to be expected, but an untrustworthiness, that even the best of men, that we all there's sort of this common sin, or this common lack, this common incompetence, or this common lack of trust that leads to evil, even though most people are good. I think that's sort of the ideas that Stuart's building on. If Mr. Benedict trusted him, Noland, shouldn't Rini? Not necessarily, right? Not intending harm and concealing reservations about trusting in someone. I'm going to skip over that for now. Then there's an amazing quote on page 154, and I love this quote. It's just really beautiful. About what I like about buttons, and this is Cannonball speaking to Constance. They're very small things that hold big things together. Awfully important buttons, little but strong. And he's referring to Constance, right? Same thing. They're very small. She's very small, but she holds the team together. A very big thing, right? Because they're saving the world. She's very little, but she's very strong. And we see this especially at the end of the first book. And that's also, I think about like buttons, like he was saying like a close button, like one of these buttons, right? But I was thinking like the nuclear button, really tiny, but it's like can change the whole world, right? And it's the same thing for us, right? Little small actions can change the whole world. So I really just like that metaphor. There's a lot of different ways you can filter through that. Um, and then, yeah, the chapter from page 184 to 194 is where we really see the character development at its finest. Um, and then, yeah, page 195. So Rini says he must remember to be careful what he says and even what he allows himself to think. So this is getting in kind of Orwellian in this book. Rini's paying attention to what he can and cannot think for the sake of others. And it's for the sake of Constance because of her pattern recognition. But this is something we should all be doing. We should all be taking care about what we think and thinking before we speak. And this is something I struggle with. And then, yeah, small but important, like Constance Buntitz's. Rini praises Sticky. Really goes into, Sticky being powerful but fragile. So you have these really nice, you have these interesting contrasts, powerful but fragile, small but important, kind of play throughout the book that I really like. And then, yeah, the end. Back to that expectation of evil, but sort of flipped over, tossed on its head. On page 424, Kate has this opportunity to blow Mr. Curtin and all these guys who are quivering and, in terror of their predicament, to blow them out of the water and say goodbye to all of them. But Kate says, except that Milligan was right. Kate was not like Mr. Curtin and his nasty associates. So this brings out an ethical discussion, which is worth mulling over, and is brought up in a lot of stories and novels, which is that you can't sue down at evil and do evil to be good, right? So if you kill the bad guys, you're doing evil because you're killing, right? You're murdering. But if you truly hate evil, then on the other hand, you have to defeat it and eliminate it, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it makes you feel. Stewart seems to take the former position. It could be because it's still kids writing a kid series, but you can't just because they're going to go out and do evil, and they might kill people and they might control people. It's a little different for this universe because they're not killing people, they're controlling people, but they are wiping people's memories, which is bad enough. Would you rather live with all your memories erased, not knowing who you are, or be dead, but still have everything about yourself intact? So they're actually, I would say, doing harms that are worse than just killing. So so what do you do, right? You don't kill them, so you let them get away so they could do more crime, right? Then you're the one who's evil. You're letting evil continue, right? So you've got to eliminate evil. But if you eliminate evil, you're doing what they do to you. You're killing them. Right? This reminds me, I was just watching Bonhoeffer, and then a video critiquing the movie, but a video talking about what he really thought, which is that in a lot of moral ambiguous situations like this one that Kate's in, we only have two bad options, and we have to rest on God, for basically because we're limited. We have a limitations in terms of our morality, and we don't have this all-knowing, omniscient nature to what the best solution is, because we're not God. And sometimes we're faced with, doing one thing or doing another, and they're both bad decisions, right? One is killing somebody, knowing that goes against our conscience, goes against our morals, because we don't kill like evil people do. But also, if we don't, we're letting them get away so they can kill people, right? So we're facilitating their killing. And you could say, well, that's their free will and their responsibility, not ours. But it was in our control to prevent that, right? We could have killed them. So, Bonhoeffer talks about how there's no way out. And so that's sort of, I would say, a discussion that Stewart mulls over. He seems to take the former position that it's actually a better choice to not let evil get away by killing them, right? If they had the chance to imprison them, right, which they do at the end of the third book, right? Spoiler alert. I guess I already gave it away, so it's not really much of an alert. But so she could never do something that would make her more like her enemy and less like her father, and that's true. That's true. But and we can relate to this. But is that not evil? So that discussion, I think, could be raised for Stewart, maybe in a more adult worthy novel. Um, and yeah, and so I think that's it. There's a lot of other things I could address, but I don't want to take too much time. The book was not as good as the first, in my opinion, but it still had its moments, some of which I try to bring out here. And the character development was off the charts. So this book really, I think its main drive, aside from the continuous, unique, and original style of Stewart, is the character development. And it was worth my time, of course. All these books are. And stay tuned for the third book in the series, The Prisoner's Dilemma, which I'll be reflecting on next.